So today we're going to look at why philosophy is important and how it should change in order to help us live our lives better, with a new book that I'll be showing you coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm Study Director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. So of course practice is the most important thing, and it's really great to practice by yourself, having learned the material on your own perhaps. Maybe you've gone to libraries, maybe you've heard from other people. But there's also a great deal of importance to learning some of this in school and learning it in ways that are more scholarly and more deep in that sense, in the sense of the history and the background and the way that these ideas that we've been talking about in this channel relate to other ideas from similar people around the world. And to that end, there's a really great book out very recently by Bryan Van Norden. It's right here. It's called Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto, which is some way of understanding that this is a popular book. This is not a book written really for a scholarly audience. It's written for a general audience. It's very readable. It's, I think, the kind of book that would be approachable to anybody with an interest in the ideas that we talk about in this channel, or in ideas in philosophy generally. So in Bryan's general take is to talk about ways in which contemporary philosophy in the West should change. And at the end, he gets into ways that philosophy is important, that we shouldn't overlook philosophy as a study. Now, just to put my cards on the table, I have a PhD in philosophy. That's my academic background. I did philosophy as an undergrad and as a graduate student. So this kind of book is dear to my heart. And the book stems from an opinion piece that Bryan Van Norden wrote with Jay Garfield, who is another professor of philosophy who actually specializes in Buddhist philosophy, in particular in sort of Tibetan Mahayana philosophy. And the two of them wrote this opinion piece for the Times a couple years ago. And basically the aim of their original article was to argue for the fact that Western philosophy is very narrow in its specialty. It only focuses almost exclusively on Anglo-European philosophy. It looks very little at philosophy outside of the Western canon of philosophers. And so their opinion piece was titled, "If Philosophy Won't Diversify, Let's Call It What It Really Is." And what they say is, look, if you're not going to bring in thinkers from around the world from different traditions, the non-Western traditions, that we should just retitle philosophy departments as departments of American and European philosophy. Because that's what they really teach. They only teach a very narrow specialization within a broader field of what we might consider world philosophy. And of course the same thing is true in so many other departments of liberal arts in the university. So in English, or in drama, or in languages, and certainly in comparative literature, we've broadened our canon, not only to look at people from Europe or from the United States, or from the Western tradition generally, but to look at people from around the world, writers from around the world, thinkers, people who made music, let's say, from around the world. We're no longer quite so parochial or limiting as to see Western stuff as the most important. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through the book sort of in the way that Bryan does, with my own sort of thoughts. First, we're going to look at sort of the history of why Western philosophy is so narrow right now. Second, we're going to look at some ways that Western and certain Eastern philosophies can talk to each other, that they approach similar kinds of problems. They're not totally talking about different things. And the third, when we get at the end, I'll talk about the ways that philosophy really is important for us, that we shouldn't overlook it, that we shouldn't think that somehow philosophy is useless in contemporary living. So what Bryan Van Norden argues is that before the 19th century, and before the 18th century in particular, philosophy among Western philosophers was thought of as a world enterprise. They didn't think of Western philosophers as somehow different from people, other thinkers around the world. This idea that Western philosophy sort of only contains people, or I should say that philosophy only contains people from the West, that's something that's relatively recent. It's not something that goes all the way back in the Western tradition. So as a great example of this, Bryan Van Norden talks about Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. And Leibniz, if you don't know him, is one of the most famous philosophers in the Western tradition, 16th, 17th, or I should say 17th, 18th century philosopher, whose writings are still read today within history of philosophy in a Western university setting. And Leibniz's opinion at the time that he was writing was that European philosophy and Asian philosophy had a lot to talk about. And I think in particular he was thinking of philosophers like Confucius from China, but he compared Eastern and Western philosophers. And he said that Western philosophers are good in certain things and Eastern philosophers are good in others. In the West, he says the West is superior because we understand the Christian revelation, so he was a Christian, so he thought that was one of the advantages of Western thinkers. He also liked the scientific orientation of Western philosophy, even at the time, which was several centuries ago. Of course, it's gotten more so now. But he said that for practical philosophy, in particular issues of ethics, issues of politics, in a daily life for real people rather than as a sort of an ideal that we look down from a God's eye view, that in the practical sense, the Chinese philosophy that he was reading was better. It was much, much advanced over its Western counterpart. And again, I think here he's thinking probably of people like Confucius and Confucius's followers. Bryan also mentions another much less famous Western philosopher, Christian Wolff, who argued similarly that Confucius, the example of Confucius showed that you could construct an ethics, a complete ethics, without needing revelation from God or from religion or some kind of naturalized religion, as ethics was seen at the time in the West. In Western philosophy at the time, many top philosophers thought of ethics as somehow coming out of religion, of coming out of the Bible, of coming out of theology. Now, I mean, I would say, as an aside, that I think if one looks at history of philosophy, one will see that in ancient Greece, in classical Greece, where the whole idea of ethics in the Western tradition begins, we didn't have, obviously, revelation. So even in the Western tradition, I don't think it's true that we need revelation to construct ethics. Also, interestingly, for our channel's purposes, early Buddhism is a similar way of constructing an ethics without needing revelation, without needing a naturalized religion. Now, of course, Buddhism became a religion in time, but in the early tradition of Buddhism, before it was a religion, where it was more philosophically oriented, more oriented around argument, around evidence, around the kinds of everyday interests that interested the Buddha himself, we would see a similar kind of argument to be made there. So the question is, why did the shift come? Where did this notion change from the idea of philosophy being a world enterprise that we could all have something to say whether we were from the West or not from the West, towards an idea where philosophy was something only done in the West? Bryan Van Norden relies on a book by Peter Park. As far as I can tell, most of his argument here comes from Peter Park's work. He argues that basically the villain here, or the person who changed the course of Western thinking in this regard, is Immanuel Kant. And Kant is a very, very important philosopher in the Western tradition who lived mostly during the 18th century. Bryan talks about two different strands here within the Kantian tradition that came out of his philosophy. In the first place, Kant, because he was so important, he had many, many followers. And his followers themselves became important within the Western tradition, but many of his followers sort of restructured or rethought all of Western philosophy, or all of philosophy as culminating in Kant, culminating in Kant's what's called transcendental idealism or critical idealism. And so it was sort of thought of that he was the culmination of all of philosophy. And once you tell that story, you then limit, philosophy to those people behind, who Kant would have read and known about. You make philosophy into a kind of isolated discussion between a certain group of people. Once it gets to Kant, of course, the argument from his followers is that basically philosophy is over, or at least, the major problems have been solved. It's all been done here. It's a European kind of enterprise. simply by telling that kind of story, therefore you isolate philosophy into a kind of European discussion. So that's the first issue. The second issue is I think, even darker than that, which is that within the European tradition at the time, European intellectuals were becoming more interested in this notion of racial superiority. That there was a distinction in races of people around the world, that they existed, these races, and that there was a distinction between them. And the distinction basically was that Caucasians, the white race, the Europeans, were superior in many important respects to other races. That was the view that was held, had begun to be held more tightly by a large number of important European intelligentsia. And what's important about that here is that this also bled over into philosophy. So just as the argument was that non-Caucasian races couldn't do many things as well as Caucasians could, it was particularly true in philosophy. So it simply resulted that people who were non-Caucasian were simply less capable of doing philosophy simply for racial reasons. And this unfortunately dovetailed with Kant's own pretty virulent racism. He was a racist, certainly by modern standards. As far as I know, even by standards of the time, he was pretty extreme. He certainly wrote about the fact that the Caucasian race or the European race was more capable of doing philosophy than other groups from around the world. And so all of these, certainly these two major strands of racism plus this kind of rewriting of philosophical history, ended up closing off the Western view towards the rest of the world as being important to know about. Very few, if any, contemporary philosophers in the West are themselves racist, openly racist, or virulently racist. Of course, I think virtually every philosopher in a major university nowadays, probably every single one, would argue that these arguments of Kant, or claim these arguments of Kant were very bad and should be rejected, and we shouldn't agree with them. Nevertheless, what Bryan Van Norden argues is that structural racism is very, very persistent, pervasive within contemporary philosophy departments. So even though individual philosophers will argue that, oh, of course, none of this stuff is true, nevertheless, the structural racism persists, that you have very few non-Western teachers in philosophy departments. You have very few people teaching non-Western philosophy. My own experience as an undergraduate at a really top school in philosophy was that basically if it wasn't Western philosophy, they didn't care about it. I don't believe that anything that wasn't Western was taught at the time. Now, this was quite a few years ago, but still, within my graduate school, there was one person in the department who taught Indian philosophy as well as philosophy from the West. But he was kind of marginalized within the department, and his approach was as a committed Christian. So he was using these philosophers from the East, from India in particular, as kind of a foil for his Christianity. I enjoyed taking classes from him. We would tend to have spirited arguments. He was a good debater, and I liked him as a person, and I like him as a person. But he was not the sort of, he was the only one in the department doing that kind of stuff, and he was really not qualified to teach Indian philosophy at that level. So you really couldn't have done, let's say, a doctorate under him in that kind of stuff, because it really wasn't enough of his specialty. Now, I mean, there are some departments in the West that do have Indian philosophy, or Chinese philosophy, or philosophy from Africa, or from the Americas, that is to say, the pre-conquest Americas. There are some, but very, very few is the argument, and certainly many fewer than there should be. So now let's turn to some ways that there are crossovers between philosophy from the East and philosophy from the West. And I'll only talk about stuff that I know about, which is early Buddhism. Bryan Van Norden talks about a number of examples from Confucianism in the book, which you might be interested in reading about. And so one of those examples is the Apannaka Sutta. The Apannaka Sutta in the early Buddhism is a sutta that has an argument for the belief in rebirth. And the argument that's given in the Apannaka Sutta by the Buddha, I believe it's the Buddha, mirrors an argument that we get many, many centuries later by a Western philosopher named Blaise Pascal. And Blaise Pascal was arguing for the existence of God. And his argument is known within philosophy and theology as Pascal's wager. And it's probably one of the most famous arguments for the existence of God within the Western tradition. The argument, in a nutshell, goes like this. It says, let's make a wager if you want to believe in God. You don't know whether God exists, but if God does exist, and you believe in God, then you're going to go to heaven. That's an infinite amount of good. If God exists and you don't, then you're going to go to hell. That's an infinite amount of bad. If God doesn't exist and you believe in him, then of course you're going to waste some time going to church on Sundays. And if God doesn't exist and you don't believe in him, then of course there's no punishment you're going to get. So you're going to get some, benefit about not having to go to church and perhaps not having to worry about certain kinds of ethical mores. He says if you look at the overall payouts of this wager, the wager makes more sense for you to believe in God because the payouts are higher. They're infinitely higher, in fact. And that's the argument. Now, there are many problems with this argument, which I won't go into. If you look it up on the internet in various places, in philosophy dictionaries and so on, you'll probably find some of the problems here. So my point is not to say this is a great argument. My point is to say it's a very famous argument. And it is an argument that, of course, has convinced many Christians. But many, many centuries earlier, perhaps millennia earlier, it's not entirely clear when the Apanaka Sutta was written, there was a similar argument within early Buddhism. And the argument that the Buddha gave, or that one of his followers gave in his name, is similarly that if you believe in rebirth, you're going to act well, and so you're going to get a good payout. If you don't believe in rebirth, and rebirth is true, then you're going to get a bad payout because you're going to do bad things, and as a result you're going to get punished. And if rebirth isn't true, and you behave well, you're going to still do well because people are going to like you. And if rebirth isn't true, and you behave badly, well, again, you're not going to get punished in the next life, but people are not going to react as well to you because you're going to be doing bad things. So either way, you should be doing well, but also it makes more sense to believe in rebirth because the payouts are higher, and you're going to tend to behave in a better way, basically. So basically what he's saying is, belief in rebirth makes you a moral person. And so you get a certain better payout out of this kind of wager. It's a very similar kind of argument. Not identical, but very, very similar. In an earlier video, I talked about the bhikkhuni or the nun Vajira's simile of the chariot. This does not come from the Buddha himself, but from one of his followers, a female monastic, as a matter of fact. She came up with this notion, or this simile, that the self is like a chariot. So just as we have the word chariot, but if we look at the actual thing, chariot, it comes apart into pieces. It's got wheels, it's got an axle, it's got a floor, it's got handlebars, it's got a post in the front that hooks to the horses. I don't remember the name of it, but you get the point, is that it comes apart into pieces. And a chariot, when you really look at it, is nothing more than an assemblage of pieces, a bunch of things that are put together in a certain way. There isn't, once you put these things together, there isn't another thing chariot that somehow is there that wasn't there before. It's simply a name we give to parts that are assembled. Similarly, she says, the self is an assemblage of bits and pieces. It's an assemblage of body parts. It's an assemblage of, we can say, physical characteristics. It's an assembly of mental parts, of perception, and of volition, and of consciousness, and of likes and dislikes, and all these other things, mental things that sort of come together to make a person. But there isn't a soul or something persisting, permanent, over and above this assemblage of mental and physical parts. And this argument for the non-existence of a soul over and above mental and physical parts mirrors in certain ways arguments of the very famous philosopher, Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, who lived in the 18th century, that there wasn't a self over and above the parts of the body and the mind. So this is, again, a mirror between philosophy much, much earlier, perhaps millennia earlier, and later Western philosophy. Indeed, one of the greatest contemporary philosophers, a man named Derek Parfit, who just died in 2017. He was actually somebody born in China, in fact, which is quite interesting. I don't know his history back then, but he was born in China. He became one of the most influential and beloved, really respected philosophers in the Western tradition. He wrote a very famous book about the mind, about the personal identity, about what people are like, what persons are like over time. And the view that he came to is one that he says in the book is the same, in his view, as the Buddha's. That is to say, he agrees with the Buddha's view of the self, that the self is nothing over and above a kind of causally connected stream of mental and physical events of a certain kind. Derek Parfit only says this in one or two places in that book, and he doesn't make anything of it. He just says, well, I sort of agree with the Buddha. In a certain way, this is a loss, because I would really love to hear what he would have had to say more about that. Now, maybe he's written about it somewhere else that I don't know about, in some of his papers or something, but at the very least, this is one example of a Western philosopher at the very top of the field right now who is willing to make these kinds of connections. And if one person is willing to make it, I'm sure it's a sort of thing that would be available to many. So again, I'm only talking about Buddhism here. Bryan Van Norden talks mostly about Confucianism, which is his specialty. But I'm sure that similar kinds of comparisons, positive comparisons, could be made with philosophers around the world. And if you don't know them, then you can't know the ways that they're subtly different and that they may make similar or slightly different arguments. And by narrowing yourself only to one particular tradition, what you're doing is narrowing the scope of arguments that you're putting in front of you. You're narrowing the way that you're understanding the world to ones that come from one particular random tradition among many. So finally, what is the importance of philosophy nowadays? Many people will say, and have said, that philosophy is somehow useless. Bryan Van Norden goes into some, I would say, almost heated detail in the ways that philosophers can be very good citizens in their normal jobs, even if they don't become professional philosophers. But that's not really the point here. The point is, what is good about philosophy? Particularly nowadays, given our social and political problems in the West, and in the United States in particular, but other countries as well, philosophy almost shouldn't need defending, because there's so many problems that could be at least clarified with a philosophical outlook. First of these is the simple difference between truth and falsity. So much of contemporary discourse in the United States is now taken over by issues of false news, of people saying out-and-out falsehoods, of people contradicting themselves, politicians just out-and-out contradicting themselves from one moment to the next. And any kind of a philosophical training, I think, will make you particularly sensitive to the difference between truth and falsity, and to the importance of non-contradiction, of not contradicting yourself, of not being a hypocrite, for a better, more clear use of terms here. Hypocrisy is a problem, because once you're willing to contradict yourself, you're willing literally to say anything. And you remove any kind of seriousness with which somebody should take your public conversation. So that's one issue in where philosophy can be very useful, is in highlighting this distinction between truth and falsity and getting us to understand it and why it's important. Another clear problem that philosophy gets at: what is justice? We may say that it's obvious to us that there's something unjust in a society where so many people have so little and are so poor and so powerless, when so few people own so much and are so powerful. And that is somehow a problem for society. It's not just. It makes the society worse. So this question, what is justice, is another issue that we come up with in philosophy, where we try to get at the question about justice. What does it make something just? What does it make something unjust, and why? And what are the various arguments? Because there are many different opinions about this, and I think to be an informed citizen, it helps to know the different opinions and the arguments for and against them. Similarly, a third point: why is ethical behavior worth doing? Why should we be ethical? Not just what is ethics, what should we do and what should we not do, but why? Which is, I think, a deeper question and a more important question. You know, we see people in the news doing all kinds of clearly unethical things within the highest realms of politics nowadays. And the question is, what's the argument for not doing that? Why shouldn't we just do the same thing? You know, what's the reasoning? Okay, that's the kind of question we would come to in a philosophy class. We could also come to it in a religion class. We could come to it on my videos that talk about why it's important to behave ethically. But philosophy is one place where that's important and where that's discussed. And the fourth issue that I'll discuss today, there are of course many others, but I can only get to a few. What is a person? What is it that makes someone a person at a particular time or over time? You might say, that's a very abstract kind of question, but it gets into issues, let's say, of abortion. When does a person start? Okay? Does a person start because there's an eternal soul that descends into the womb at a certain time, at the time of conception? If that's what a person is, then by definition, abortion is murder. Okay? Or is being a person a vague issue, something vague that develops over time, where there isn't a clear-cut answer of when a person begins? That perhaps it begins when the brain and nervous system are at a certain level of development. In that case, perhaps abortion at certain times is not murder because there isn't a person there to be killed. They haven't come into existence yet. What you have before that is just a cell, a kind of a human cell, but it isn't any more important than, say, a skin cell or something, because there isn't a real person there. These are questions that at the end of the day are philosophical questions. And by philosophical, I distinguish that from scientific, because many people will say, oh, any question can be answered by science. And of course, many questions can be answered by science, many important questions, and I am a great lover of science and the scientific method. But if you want to ask, what is a person, you're not going to get an answer from science. The only thing that you can say is, once you've decided that a person is, let's say, some kind of particularly advanced brain and nervous system, then science will tell you when it develops. But you have to decide that that's what you mean by a person first. If you decide that a person is a soul that's an eternal soul associated with a particular body, science isn't going to tell you anything about that, because a soul is not the sort of thing that science has any input on. Similarly, if we're asking about justice or about ethics, science isn't going to tell you what makes some society just and another one unjust, or why it's ethical to do certain things and not other things. So that's the importance of philosophy. Or to put it a different way, philosophy is one of the main defenses against a certain kind of deep ignorance. Ignorance is the problem here. Ignorance is the basic problem within Buddhism and within so much of the world. If we know about the problems that Buddhism notices with the world, they are greed, hatred, and ignorance. And of those three, ignorance is the deepest, because it's ignorance itself that allows greed and hatred to arise. Once we lose sight of what we have of our wisdom, then we tend to be pulled one way or another by our greeds and by our hatreds. Ignorance leads to an ill-informed citizenry. It leads to bad political decisions. It leads to bad people becoming elected. It leads to bad societal problems that we all then have to deal with. And the best way of overcoming this, then, is to broaden our view of philosophy, to take in ideas from around the world, from people that we aren't necessarily immediately familiar with, to try to get an understanding of them, to see the good ideas that they may provide us. And of course, maybe to decide that some of them are not good and we'll put those aside. That's fine. But if you don't know about them, you can't make that decision to begin with. And so Bryan's book, which I'll show again here on the screen, I'll have a link to it down below. It'll be an affiliate link, so I'll get a couple of pennies if you end up buying one through that link, but you don't have to. It doesn't cost you any more either way. Taking Back Philosophy. A highly recommended book. It's a popularly written book. It's readable by anybody, and I think Bryan makes some really good arguments. So I hope you agree with this. If you have any questions, I really would love to hear them. Put them down below. I always love your questions, and I think they're important, especially with issues of philosophy nowadays. So I hope to see you on the next one of these videos. Thanks so much for being here, and be well.